to me. So thanks so much, Layla. I was like, oh, Bletchley Park. So I asked Layla, please can I come speak at your user group? So I was also pretty, just really astonished by this turnout, so thank you. And I was speaking at a domain-driven design microservices conference in London the last couple of days, which was kind of cool by Skills Matter. Does anybody go to their training or the conferences? And they have their .NET conference in the fall.
September, yeah.
Yeah, I'll probably maybe there. I might actually, they're trying to talk me into doing a workshop, and I'm not really into like the whole classroom training thing.
It's quite good at
But, well, it's just me, like preparing 2 days of material, anyway, so I may be doing that, so keep an eye out for that. So I was just at a domain-driven design conference, right, and I do EF Core 3, or EF Core, so what I want to talk about today, unless people have just lots of other kinds of questions, we could talk about that, but what I have to prepare to show you is kind of combining Entity Framework Core and domain-driven design ideas. And if you don't know what domain-driven design is, don't worry. I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the beginning and hopefully get you a little excited about that as well. Or if you don't use EF, I should just get a little gauge of that. So who uses any flavor of Entity Framework? Okay. And who's using ES6 still? I'm not judging, it's just, I know how that goes, right? And who's using EF Core in production? Nice. Anybody playing with EF Core 3 yet? Like just it's in preview. So that's one more than me. As a matter of fact, last week, so you may have seen on Twitter, I was like, okay, I'm gonna finally install .NET Core 3 on my computer so I can see like if my demos still run in EF Core 3. So EF Core 3 along with, EF Core 3 along with .NET Core 3, yeah, they're all going to come out together, ASP.NET Core 3. They're destined for the fall, so there's a lot of stuff. Actually, somebody was asking me about ES6 and .NET Core, and I'm not sure if you're aware that the team is actually porting ES6 so that it will run in .NET Core 3. So that's really great because we've got so much code and so much production code using ES6. You can take advantage of .NET Core stuff and still be able to use ES6
Julie,
if you want.
do you want a stool to sit on? Or you're outstanding for the session?
No, I'm good.
Good.
Yeah. Even when I work, I have a standing desk at a treadmill, so I'm a stander. So yeah, this is not like, oh, we wrote all these books. The reason I'm showing this is because, right, it's like Reese's peanut butter cups, right? Like you got your peanut butter and you got your chocolate, and whoever thought they would go good together, oh my gosh, they go well together. So like here I am, like, Entity Framework, data, focus, ORM, all these years, right? Like I've always been, even before Entity Framework, I was very data focused, always interested in interacting with the data in your database, persisting, how all that works. And also, I think it's a lot of fun. I'm not a DBA, I'm not a data scientist, but I still think it's a lot of fun when the client has some kind of weird question and I have to open up SQL Server Management Studio and just start doing all these queries and find data. That's a lot of fun too. So, a lot of people know that I've been working with Entity Framework for a long time. But I've also been working with domain-driven design. I've been pretty focused on it, I would say, for maybe about 6 years now. And if you know domain-driven design, one of kind of a contradictory thing about it is, it's the whole idea is just forget about data persistence. Right? Like, don't think about data persistence. It's about the domain and designing things for the domain and not letting problems with the data persistence or data schema or anything like that get in the way of solving the problems of your domain, your business logic, and your core business logic. So it is kind of a juxtaposition that I'm like, oh, I do all this EF Core stuff and I'm doing all this DDD stuff. But what's really important is, even though it's DDD, it's like all about the domain and not about the data, like forget about the data. Database persistence, you shouldn't think about it all when you're doing DDD. Eventually, you need to persist your data, right? And so I care a lot about, can I use Entity Framework 6 or EF Core? Can I use that for just to persist my data, even though I'm really focused on the design and the guidance that I get out of DDD? So I'm going to start with an overview of domain-driven design, just so you know why I care about not only DDD, but why I care about how DDD and a framework get along. So DDD, the D in DDD, one of the Ds, is domain, not database, not data. And people do say, well, what is a domain? So it's your business domain, like what is important about your business. And as a matter of fact, within that, we really try to identify the core domain, like the moneymaker, right, in your business. You might have to worry about payroll, but is payroll your business? No, like what is it that is your moneymaker? Like Volkswagen, right? Building amazing vehicles, right? That's their, I would say, their core domain. So it's really focused on that and not really the secondary or even cross-cutting concerns. And data persistence really is a cross-cutting concern. It's the same way security is, if you think about it. Now, I come from a database-driven world. I've been programming for 30 years, a long time, right? And I was, I came up through FoxPro, before FoxPro, DBase 3. Okay, let's play the game. DBase 3, anybody? Yeah, but I'm still probably the oldest person in the room. Okay, DBase 3, Clipper 87. 1987, I'm talking about, Clipper 87. Oh my God. And then back to DBase. That's right, went to Clipper because DBase 4 came out and something was really wrong with it. So we all went over to Clipper, but then DBase 4 1.1 came out, so that was okay. Then FoxPro 2.0, anybody? Right, and then Microsoft bought it, and they were like, oh no, they're gonna ruin it. Like we say about everything they buy, and then it's wonderful. So FoxPro, and then Access. Right. Oh, my people! That's awesome. The Access, that was kind of my transition towards VB. So VB, I started with VB5, and I used it against the Access, like the Access database. What was that? MD? I don't remember, whatever, right? And then I started using SQL Server in the back end. So VB5, VB6, then .NET. So VB.NET, and I got tired of getting laughed at. It happened. I was at a conference, I was speaking at a conference in Bulgaria, and I was doing a really deep dive, really very advanced technical talk on Entity Framework. This is like maybe even the first version, I don't even know. And there's like 200 people in the room, and I'm talking about conceptual stuff, and then I open up code, and they all start laughing. I swear to God, I'm checking my zipper. I'm like, what are they laughing at? And I started asking, which is really hard because in Bulgaria, when they say yes, they go like this. And when they say no, they go like this. And I couldn't tell if when they were going like this, they were just trying to be helpful and do it the American way, or if they were saying it was really confusing. Anyway, what I finally understood was they were laughing because it was VB code. Like, that's really mean. Anyway, so yeah, I switched that. So, now C# and .NET Core and all of that. So that's where I am. So I was always database focused, design the database. Go into you gotta write a new application. What do? You start by designing the database schema, the database tables, and then it's like, oh, we need a front end for this. Okay, here, clients, just use SQL Server Management Studio. I'm done, right? We don't need anything else. So anyway, so that really was my background. And data persistence was a really, really important part of it. But now with domain-driven design, data persistence is a secondary, right, cross-cutting concern, like all of these other things. Now I'm mentioning here also other types of domains. So within your whole domain, like, okay, Volkswagen, they build vehicles, they probably build commercial vehicles, they have financing, they have advertising, right? They have offices all over the world, right? So there might be representations of other kinds of domains in there, but they're not their core domains. They're not their money makers. They might be generic. There might even be some kind of a problem they need to solve that is so generic that they can like just use APIs, like HR or payroll or things like that. So all those things go away, and with DDD, I mean, you still have to deal with all those things, but it's really important to focus, like as Eric Evans, who wrote the DDD book, the first one, he says laser focus on the core domain. Another really important thing to understand, again, as an overview of domain-driven design. Now, I often focus on one part of it, which is what we call tactical design. So I always want to make sure people understand that DDD is much more than that. DDD really starts out with what we call strategic design, where you're working very, very closely with your clients and collaborating with them and really kind of analyzing, discovering what is your domain, like really figuring out with them what is their domain, what's the core domain, right? Just to kind of breaking things down. What are things you do and things you worry about that you can just, kind of move to the side because, oh yeah, we just use we use QuickBooks for that, right? We don't need to write our own software for that. Or something that's a little more generic that is kind of a supporting domain as opposed to the very core domain. So all of this kind of analysis is really, really important before you sit down and even try to architect your system, right? You just what is your system? What is it that we want to focus on? And another important piece in here, and there's a lot more to it than this, but I just want to point out also this sentence here, derive ubiquitous language for each subdomain. So what ends up happening is, as you're talking about maybe the core domain or one of the supporting domains, you start finding common terminology. And I don't mean programmer terminology. It's really more about the business, right? Because you're going to work, these are your clients, right? You're going to work, whether your client could just be somebody else in your company, right? But somebody who understands that business. And it's really the language of their problems that you're solving that starts becoming the common language that you all use, so you're always on the same page. And it's a lot easier, I think, unless you're doing something like deeply scientific, like something that's really very deep in some other area. A lot easier for the developers and the technology people to understand the business language versus trying to get them to talk about everything in technology and programming language, right? And the reason it's almost like a glossary, right? So you never have to be translating. You're always working, you're collaborating, you really understand each other, because when you're working on this particular domain, you have certain words that mean certain things, certain concept, and everybody is on the same page. Maybe when you're working in a different domain, you have a different set of terminology that's important, right? So it's in DDD, that's referred to as a ubiquitous language. It's not just ubiquitous in your conversations when you're talking about this particular domain, but it goes through the whole process. So these terms even come into your code. So the business people that you're working with, you could actually show them some of your code and they would be able to read a little bit of it because they would recognize the terms from your ubiquitous language. You won't always have to be translating. So that's actually a really important thing, and it begins evolving while you're doing the strategic design. Once you have that, then you can start building your domain models, modeling your application, right? Defining your classes, defining what, maybe the projects will differ, like in Visual Studio, like the Visual Studio projects. defining your classes, defining the relationships between classes. That's when you start getting into the actual tactical design where you're implementing this stuff. And I like that phrase of bringing structure to the ubiquitous language of the subdomain that you're working on. So quite often, especially for me as a developer, I started in the tactical design. I really did, and then kind of grew my knowledge out of there and my ability to really benefit from DDD practices. And as I started aligning some of this stuff to entity framework, that's absolutely tactical, right? Now we're talking about the domain models and how they're persisting to the database. So I won't talk really any more about strategic, but I think it's really important, especially when people are getting their first glimpse of domain-driven design, not to just see, oh, it's just about how to map your classes into the database. It's actually, that's not even part of it, but that's what I'll be focusing on. So I just want to make sure it's really clear that you have a bigger picture of what DDD is all about. And the other thing you probably heard as I'm describing these different things, this collaboration is so important throughout the whole process. Okay, I think of like I've seen this really made me mad. I have a client I've worked with for like 25 years. Maybe if you follow me on Twitter once in a while, you hear me or read me going, oh, I have to go to work in the Foxborough 2.6 application again. It's 75 years old. Please let it die. Or the VB6 application. Every once in a while, somebody reminds me, you know why you still have to work on them is because you did a really good job writing them. Like, oh, okay, that's not so bad. So they hired somebody to write a replacement of of Foxborough 2.6 app. And this guy, he never talked to them. He basically decided after, that he could presume he understood their business. He never asked them questions. And he kept working on it. He had given them a flat fee for writing it, so my client was like, whatever. But they never used it. They never used it. They hated working with him. He didn't understand anything about their business. It's so important, like the collaboration, but even as you get into the tactical design, right, you can still, if you're using that ubiquitous language, even in your code, or maybe you're making diagrams of things, right, ideas and concepts will be recognizable, but collaborate throughout. So I'm going to focus much more then on the tactical design, and maybe there's some words in there. Actually, don't look at them. Where is the? I'm surprised that I don't have the picture of the full map. This is a tiny little bit of the full mind map of domain-driven design. Okay, so which is fine. This is what I'm going to focus on. Otherwise, we're going to be here all night because I'm going to just teach you everything I ever learned. So this is a tiny little part, and this is the part that focuses on fleshing out or implementing what you've learned from the strategic design. Not to say that every once in a while you might be working on it and like something comes up and you go back to the strategic design and things shift, right? And you have some new ideas and do it better. So it's not like a waterfall thing, right? You can go back and keep looking at them. But we have what might be familiar terms in here. And I'm going to drill more into them as we relate this to actual code, classes, and also entity framework. But we have entities, of course, and entities, don't confuse them with what we refer to as entities in entity framework. Right? Those are framework entities, but they have a lot in common. Right? An entity has an identity. That's, it's a class or an object that has a unique identity and a unique identifier. Right? So we have that like ID, right, in our entities. And this is almost embarrassing, and maybe I shouldn't say it, but why does that ever stop me? I had this revelation one day when I was like, oh, ID, entity, identity. Ah.
That's it.
I don't know. It's just like, why did I ever notice that before, right? But because it really distinguishes that. And that distinguishes it dramatically from this was just another kind of object, another kind of class we call value objects. And a value object, I'm going to talk about them. But value objects are classes that don't have just like a single identifier. They're actually, what makes them unique is the composition of all their properties. I'll talk more about that. Aggregates, that is a graph of classes that'll go together. They're essentially, everything that goes together in a transaction. Factories and repositories, I'm not gonna focus on that too much. So there we go. So, domain-driven design, one of the really, really important things is as you're designing your domain, you're really focusing on the domain. As a matter of fact, I heard something really, a nice perspective the other day. Somebody said, the domain is the problem you're solving and the model is the solution. Kind of interesting, I like that, right? So as we're kind of mapping out our domain model, we're not thinking about how it's going to fit into the database, because so often what we'll do is we start worrying about problems here and we change what's going on here. And as we change things logic and relationships in our domain model to make the database happy, then we start losing a lot of the value that we put in here to solve the problem. Right now we're starting to solve data problems instead. So with DDD, one of the big lessons was just don't worry about those things, because you can really solve your domain problems a lot more fluidly and a lot more simply. The subtitle of Eric's domain, we refer to that as, we in the DDD community, we refer to it as the blue book, right? It was the first book and it was blue. So the subtitle of that is, oh my gosh, removing complexity in complex systems. Oh my, I should know that by heart, right? But it's about getting rid of complexity, right? And I really like that. I like making my life as simple as possible. I like removing impediments. So by taking away, involving these problems of schema and persisting data, we can really focus on a more streamlined way of using patterns to really focus on the logic of solving our problems. So there is a brick wall between our domain model and the data model. And in a perfect world, I wouldn't be talking about entity framework, because in a perfect world, we would build an actual second model, like an additional logical model that matches our database schema directly. So it's easy to just go bloop, 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 data in here, and then use some kind of a mapper to get back and forth between our domain model, which is designed very specifically to solve the problems of our domain, and this data model, which very nicely makes it easy for me to get my data in and out of the database, right? So that's like the white tower. And it's not just, I shouldn't say that like, ooh, the white tower, because there are times when I still need this, right? Even if I'm using Entity Framework, and I'll explain why. So Entity Framework is a mapper. Entity Framework, when you create a DB context, or I think I had a conversation either here, or was it when I was in London with somebody who's still using the very first version of Entity Framework, and they're really trying to get their application away from that. And therefore, I mentioned that because that's the object context from the earlier versions and using the EDMX. But that DB context, that actually creates for you the data model. The DB context is the data model. And I had a lot of problems with some of the people, a few people who are DDD people. They're like, how could you ever tell people to use Entity Framework? They should never be mapping directly from the domain to the database. But I'm like, I'm not directly mapping from there. This is my mapper. It's an object relational mapper, right? This builds the data model. So I'm not trying to shove this into there, and therefore defining my domain model to match the data model, the database. the entity framework, DB context, actually does that mapping for us, right? And then we can tweak it, right? We can go into the DB context, or if you use, I use them so infrequently, I can't even think what they're called now, use the attributes to tweak the mapping, so I don't use them, and I'll tell you why. Because that, to me, is putting database logic back in my domain model. I don't want it there. So I can very nicely put it all into Entity Framework. So Entity Framework really is a mapper. Every once in a while, you come to, I don't have that visualized. Every once in a while, I come to a situation where even Entity Framework can't do a nice job of taking my domain and mapping it. Like there are limitations, which is some of what I want to be. I want to show you how well it does so many things, and also maybe highlight a couple of things it doesn't do well, right? And then you have to make a decision, right? Can I accept making a tweak in my domain model to make Entity Framework Core happy, right? Or, okay, is this enough of a reason for me to just go ahead and create a data model and not depend on Entity Framework to do this, right? In certain situations. But for the most part, it's another one of those 80-20 rules, right? I'm like, why build an extra data model, build in all that extra work if Entity Framework is just going to do it? So I just see how much will Entity Framework do for me, and if I get into a situation where I think, I really do need to build an extra data model here, then I'll do that. But mostly all I'm doing when I'm working on my domain models is focusing on the business problem, the business logic that I'm trying to solve, period, and I don't have to worry about that. So EF Core has really raised the bar for how much of nicely designed DDD style domain models can map directly into the database, and it's getting better and better. So the first version came out 3 years ago. I thought that was a long time ago until Matt showed me his 11-year-old copy of the very first printing of the very first edition of my very first book. Okay, and then EF Core 2. So EF Core 1. Is anybody still using EF Core 1 in production? Good. And then so that was kind of a V1, right? Back to scratch V1. But EF Core they really started putting EF Core was really production ready. They're really EF Core 2, production ready. They really started putting more and more of the things we're used to from EF6, and also some of the things we've been asking for a long time. And one of the reasons EF Core 1 was, and still EF Core 2 didn't have everything we were used to having in EF6, is, they're building it from scratch, right? They're building it better. They're building it in a way that allowed them to take it so much further than they ever could before with EF6, right? Because they were stuck with these really old APIs. So it was really worth it to kind of start from scratch and then just start adding the features that we really need from ES6, but also the newer features in there. So 2.0 came out a couple of years ago, 2.1, 2.2 came on and brought us a lot of improvements even on top of 2.0. And 3 is coming out in fall along with .NET Core 3. So just to have that as kind of a level set of where we're at with that. So as Entity Framework Core has been evolving, it's been making it easier and easier. Like they really have a focus on value objects and these different DDD concepts, and the way we're modeling what our domain models are looking like when we're designing them with the DDD ideas in mind. And they're making EF Core more amenable to a lot of those things, right? So we don't have to fight it. But also, we don't have to constantly say, we can't use EF Core, we have to have a data model, right? We have to just have a mapper and then have an actual extra data model. So more and more, I'm able to design things the way I really want to from the guidance and the things I learned from domain-driven design. And EF isn't fighting me anymore to do that, so I can use it on most of the work that I'm doing or work that I'm doing with clients. I have to cough, and I'm trying to see where the microphone is.
test.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a bunch of code and then talk about how a bunch of code that's designed in a DDD way. I'm going to make sure you understand what it is about that code that comes from domain-driven design, and then show you code so you can see and maybe run some tests, or maybe just say this works. All right, it's really nice. Let's move on. With a bunch of different demos of that, and I'm going to evolve the domain model. So as it starts out, it isn't going to be like my most beautifully designed, DDD influenced design model, because I'm going to show you kind of one piece at a time, and then I'm going to evolve it so you can see how it changes. So you can see, some kind of ideas in there that are DDD, aggregates, value objects, and how they work, and how Entity Framework still can persist them into the database without me having to do too much extra stuff. So this is my basic model, and it's really, really simplified. And I have to say that when I originally did this, when I originally did this, I was giving a presentation in Amsterdam. And so all of my demo code, like my sample code and test code, it's football teams from Amsterdam. Okay, so you can just boo, and I'll know you're not booing my code, you're just booing the data. So I was like, oh, I should just spend 5 hours changing all of the sample data for every country or every city I go to. I'm like, yeah, forget it, I'm not doing that. Anyway, so I have a team, right? I have this graph of data. I have a team, and a team has players, and a team has a manager, well, one manager at a time, over time they have many managers. And so we have to keep a history of the team managers. And also every team has their kind of unique uniform colors. So the way this works out from a DDD perspective is, if we think of this graph, we call this an aggregate, right? These are all these relationships that I want to keep together. So, it would be in some cases, in a particular context, I care about these all at once and they're in a transaction. And really, all I have to say, in my domain, right, in the software that I want, that's how it works, right? Because it's going to be different from everybody. So we can argue, the logic of this, but we would have already dealt with that during strategic design. So this is what we came up with. Me and all the people in my brain. So the team is really what we call, in this aggregate, the team is really in control of everything else that's going on in the aggregate, right? The team class knows how to add players and when to add players, what's acceptable, what the rules are around a team having players, right? I don't want player to have the logic of when it should be added to a team, because what if I want to avoid having a duplicate player and I have to check the player's name? Well, one player object isn't going to know anything about the other player object, but the team, if the team is in control of all of its players, it can say, oh, I've got all these different player objects. We already have you. That's a mistake or something. But this becomes what we call this in an aggregate. The one that the class that is really in control of everything that happens in the aggregate is referred to as an aggregate group. So this is in charge. We have a bunch of players. And another interesting thing is I have a full name, right? A player has a name, and a manager has a name, and I have some rules about how I want to manage names, right? So instead of putting the first name and the last name and those rules into player, and then the first name and the last name and those rules to manager, I have another class called person full name. But you're going to see why person full name it's going to be one of these value objects. I'll explain that as we get to it. So I'll go into the details of these different ideas as I go to the different demos. So I also want to say, especially with respect to the aggregate root is in control, right, of everything that's happening in its graph. And I really like this because it speaks to my favorite kind of design, which is ADD. You know what this is, right? You got it figured out? Right? Attention deficit disorder design, because I am a control freak, like every other programmer, right? Aren't you a total control freak? So the idea of designing this aggregate in a way that, or the aggregate root in a way that nobody can interact with all the other objects it's in control of without my permission. So my code really controls what people can do, what people can and can't do inside of my aggregate. And domain-driven design really gives me a lot of ideas and tools and logic to write code that way. So maybe that's why it appeals to me so much. So this is just a little map. I was trying to organize the different problems NA Framework is helping me solve with respect to mapping. So I just give a little code, like I have some that protect my aggregate, right, that ADD, right? I have patterns that I'm using to make sure that nobody does what I don't want to happen. They only follow my rules when they interact with my classes. I also am going to talk about a few things where new features in EF Core just get rid of extra code I was forced to add into my domain models to make Entity Framework Core happy. And every time I've ever had to do that, it's like, oh God, please don't make me do that, But I kind of weigh the pros and cons of, okay, how bad is this going to be if I just make this little tweak in my domain model versus not just the amount of effort, but side effects, things like that might happen if I have to write another data model, right? Usually it's like, I don't want to do all this extra work, right? But, it's pros and I have to weigh to pick your poison. And then another thing that I'm finding with some of the new features in Entity Framework Core is that the team has been writing in functionality that helps reduce some of the side effects that might come from either, a model that's designed a little too much in a way of trying to make Entity Framework Core happy. So you'll see as we go along, but that's why it's just sticking this little map there. Another thing I want to say about all these demos is I'm not going to take the time to do all this, but as I was creating them, I had 3 levels of testing to make sure everything works. First of all, does it build, right? So .NET Build on all of them. But another really interesting one is because I'm involving Entity Framework, I will also at each level validate the DB context. So if you're using the CLI, the command line interface, you can also do this with the PowerShell commands too, just different syntax. But you have a way of just saying, check the DB context, just run through and read the DB context and make sure, tell me what you know about it. And if it can do this, if it succeeds at doing this, then I know I've written this in a way that Entity Framework understands. So that's really important also, because a lot of the times some of the kind of problems that might occur that would also cause this to fail, you might not see until runtime, right? It builds, your tests run, but when you're trying to do this one particular thing, it's not going to show up until runtime, the kind of problem. There's a side effect kind of a problem. And also I have a bunch of tests. So I have tests that are strictly my word is in Vermont, I think. Strictly unit tests. I forgot the word unit test. Somebody please give me some more caffeine, oh my God. So some are strictly unit tests to make sure that as I'm designing my domain models, my classes, that that logic just unto itself works as I expect. But I also have integration tests. I have two levels of integration tests. Some take advantage of the memory, the in-memory database. Now I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna forget every single word I know in any framework. There's an in-memory provider that will actually create like a little mini database. It's really just lists, right? It creates them in memory. So it uses that for persisting. It persists to the list and pulls data from the list. So I have a bunch of integration tests that are, they're interacting with entity framework and entity framework logic. And then I have a third set that I bring in towards the end, which are integration tests that actually write to a database, right? So you can, because at some point you want to see what's going on in the database. So I'm not going to do all of these for each one of the tests, but I just want to make sure you understand. So one very important pattern that goes with ADD, DD, right? Being a total control freak, is encapsulating properties, right? Encapsulating your data so nobody can come in and do things to it that are not how you intended it to be working. So this was actually something that was newly introduced in Entity Framework Core 3. We didn't have it in EF6. You all saw me like pick up the water bottle and never have a drink, right? I'm gonna do it now. I'm thinking, I hope the microphone isn't so close to my throat that you can hear me gulping my water down.
We can't, that's fine.
Yeah. Sorry, my middle name is TMI, just to let you get past that right now, if you didn't know that about me yet. So this is one really important way to protect your data. So Entity Framework Core now lets you, we've always been able to encapsulate at some level encapsulate properties, but you can encapsulate scalar properties, but also now Entity Framework has a comprehension of backend fields. So even if it can't find, if Reflection can't find your property because you've hidden it so that nobody will do anything to it, it can still understand how to persist with a backend field. So I just want to show you that. This is where I have to keep going back and forth from my glasses. Okay, so I have this demo that has a whole lot of branches to it. Now, oh no.
Command F1.
No, you know what? Did I? If this isn't in presentation mode, we're back there, right? Okay, that's weird. Do some science on this. Huh, okay, yeah, it's like not mirroring, it's just doing the alternate screen. Okay, at least I know what's going on, then I can control it. It's fine. Go away. Okay, so first of all, just in case nobody noticed yet, I'm using a Mac. MacBook in Mac OS. I'm not using a Mac and then just booting into Windows. So I'm using Visual Studio Code, right? So it just looks a little different than Visual Studio, but everything I'm doing in Visual Studio maybe works just to they work a little bit differently. So I have, just so you have some context of what we're looking at, over here on the left, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate projects, right? Console that has a CS project. So I've got a console project we're never going to look at. I've got a data project, because I like to, separation of concerns, not even for a demo, I just can't bear to smush everything into one project. So I got a data project, this is where my context is, my Entity Framework context. I've got a domain project, very simplified, but this is where my domain classes are. And then I have a test project down here. This is where my different tests are. And then finally, I have something called a shared kernel. That's DDD speak for common library. Although there's a lot of really important things to understand about what you would share in a shared kernel across what we refer to as, across your different projects, your different bounded contexts, and I don't want to get into the whole, the reason I like this is like, I want to teach you everything about domain-driven design, but I can't. So I'm just going to back away from that. Anyway, so this is kind of like common library, but just, have an understanding that we don't just have a common library that we use across our whole solution when we're in domain-driven design. In there I have infrastructure things and also that little person full name class that I was telling you about. We'll look more closely at that one later when we're talking about value objects, so stop exposing yourself there, you. So those are my 5 projects, and there's a solution, and not much else. This is just so VS Code knows how to do some stuff. What else do we care about? Let me just close that and maybe take a little bit of a look at the code that is our domain. Okay, so I have my team class, right? I have that. And team has in it just a bunch of properties. We've got a team name. We've got a nickname for the team, the year founded, the home stadium, a list of players, some logic for adding a player, and look, testing to make sure we're not adding a duplicate player, right? So there's some logic in there. Not too much in here. You'll see a few more interesting things as we go along. Okay, so that's the team. Player's pretty simple. It has one of those person full name. So instead of first name and last name and the rules in here, it's relying on a different class. And that's really all, and an ID, so it's unique ID. We've got a manager. It's about the same. It's got its unique ID, right? It's got its person name and some other things we're tracking, like what's the current team that we're on. And also, do we have a history? Does this person have a history of other teams it's been on in the past? It's he, she, they, right? We say they, that person. Are there any women team managers in football in the UK? Yeah. I like looking at you because I have to look at the women because it's like maybe you'd be like, yeah, woman, team manager, I don't know. Yeah, I have no idea. So, it's really pretty simple, but the team is what's most important and in control of everything. And you'll see some more of those in control things in a bit. So first I want to focus on the fact that I'm able to completely encapsulate scalar properties. So here's a scalar property, it's a string, it's the team name. I originally had public string, team name, so it's exposed, right? And you could get at the getter, and then you had to go somewhere else to set the value, but you had the value exposed through the property, right? And to set the property, the only way to set the property was here, this original code. In the constructor, right, you'd pass the team name in and it would set that property. But I decided, in our design, we decided that we really don't want, to expose team name for, publicly for any reason. So if anybody wants to get at the team name, right, they can only really get to it through here. And so we have this property, which is the local field of this class. And if I want to see the team name, then I'm just going to return the local field, but I can't really edit it or do anything like that to it. And this is something, so I want to not worry so much about why, in this particular case we're encapsulating, because this is kind of a random example, because I just wanted to take, a simple string, simple scalar property and show you the important thing, which is that normally Entity Framework would never have been able to find this because it was encapsulated. But now Entity Framework is able to see the team name, even though, so I'm going to back up. Entity Framework was only able to discover these properties if there was either a public getter or a public setter, okay? It didn't have to have both, but it had to have a setter and a getter, one of them had to be public. So you couldn't make team name private. You couldn't make the getter private. Or entity framework wouldn't even have any comprehension that it exists because it's so dependent on reflection. So we decided we really wanted to encapsulate it, but by doing this, now entity framework wouldn't be able to see it, right? We hid it, we still let people read it because we were returning the field. But entity framework would not be able to see this because we weren't following the rules that it needed, right? So people were prevented from encapsulating in this way. And now what's really cool is entity framework by default can read, actually recognize that, using reflection and its rules, it can recognize this when it's time to materialize stuff, right? So this wasn't so much an issue when it was, when you're persisting the data, but when you were reading data, it would need this public getter it would need this available to it in order to know this property existed and how to populate it. But now it's able to understand that through a private field, like a backing field. It just has that capability. There's default, you can configure it, there's things you can do to tweak it. And there's, we're a number of cases where this was a really big deal for a lot of people. I don't know, has anybody ever run into that problem when you're trying to really encapsulate properties and any framework just was like, no, sorry. And then, so now you're changing your domain model and you're changing the rules that you built into there to make entity framework happy and you didn't want to. So anyway, this is a really important thing. I'm not going to bother going through all of the tests for everything because I know that you trust me when I say this works. So I'd rather just move on because to me, this one isn't even one of the most important ones. That require really digging into it. I do have, among my tests, I do have tests, so if you want to take this code and run them, I do have these in-memory tests that do check and validate that, okay, we can still find the team name. It's not really a big deal at all. This code is fine. This is Visual Studio Code, maybe because I'm going back and forth to all these different branches, I keep seeing that it pretends that this stuff isn't really working, even though it does. Control, till, yeah, .NET build, let's go back out. There. It just drives me crazy. .NET build, I just want to make sure the squiggly lines are complete lies. And I need to prove it to myself before I dare move on. This is called ADDDD, right? This is the ADDD TikTok. Why is it restoring? Okay, well that thing, it works perfectly fine, so I'm just going to stop worrying about it. This was an even bigger problem. So we had, there were ways around encapsulating scalar properties, but this was something we really never could do, which was encapsulating collections. There was no way. So if we wanted to have a collection, for example, our players collection. So please be finished with whatever you're doing here. I don't know why you're being so ridiculous. I'll show you Visual Studio Code. You saw it, I just closed it completely. Oh, you see it's a new color? John Papa wrote this really cool extension for VS Code called Peacock. And so if you want to have a number of Visual Studio Code instances open and you can't tell which one's which, they'll like just be randomly different colors every time you open it. I just love that. I'm worried that it thinks it needs to go to the internet to do restoring, but I'm pretty sure I was able to restore without going to the internet before. Now what's happening? Settings JSON, I don't care. What are you doing to me? You came all this way. Okay, so encapsulating collections. Now I'm going to go over to team, and I showed you very, very briefly before that I had a really simplistic property here that was a list of players. And I had a getter and a private setter. So typically, I'll have getters and private setters. I start with getters and private setters. And the private setters at least help me make sure people don't come in, use my object and just randomly change values without following my rules. That's why the setters are private. So I'll have methods that allow them to do it, or maybe in the case of the constructor, it's really important to make sure I never have an invalid team, right? Like, why bother instantiating a team in an invalid state? So our definition in the case of this domain of a valid team is it has to have a team name, it has to have a nickname, it has to have the year founded, and it has to have a home stadium, right? There's no point in creating one without it, right? So in the case of these scalars, I'm just passing those things in, and also, by the way, I'm instantiating a new ID every time I create that new team. Now, for the case of players, I started out, I didn't really have a way. Well, I had a way. I had this didn't exist, and this didn't exist at the beginning. Let's just take it out so you can see what it looked like at the beginning, close to this. This was just the players class. So I had a list of players. It had a public getter, so I could read it anytime I want, but it had a private setter. The only way to set that, right? You think this is like the logic. It's like, oh, this way I can control how people add things, right? I can only add here. But that's really not I can only add by saying, using the add player method, because that's where I have my nice logic that says, make sure I don't add a duplicate player, okay? But that really doesn't protect me from people just saying players.add, right? Because this setter, that's about setting the list. That's saying players is a new list of players. Here's a new list of players. Once that exists, as long as I have access to the getter, I can just say players.add, players.remove, players do whatever you want to the players list. So before, with EF6, it was, what we had to do was either write some crazy logic around it or, do hoops. There really wasn't a way around it. We had to say, please, when you use the team class, please always use the add player. Please remember to always use the add player when you're using the class, right? Like, hope nobody goes around and just adds it and removes it through the players, right? So we could never protect it. And the reason is, if I took that and turned it into something, this is a standard pattern for encapsulating a collection, right? So what I'm doing here is saying I've got a private collection of the variable field _players, and then my public players class is going to return the list of those players, period. So I don't really have a way of writing to those players. So that is the way I wanted to write it, but Entity Framework in that case had no knowledge because it uses reflection. It had no way of knowing there was a players class, or a players property in this class. So whenever I tried to retrieve data, it would never be able to materialize a list of players if that was included in there. Just had no clue whatsoever. So now Entity Framework Core lets us do that, right? And there's a couple of things that they've done, but one of the keys was that Entity Framework Core will now recognize IEnumerable. So IEnumerable is a way to protect that player's property because IEnumerable only lets you enumerate through it. It doesn't let you do anything else to it. It only lets you, it's essentially read-only when it's IEnumerable, right? So Entity Framework now, EF Core now recognizes IEnumerable, and now I can totally protect how any interaction with the players happens in the team, right? And you know, if you've never struggled with this particular problem, you might be wondering, why is she spending so much time talking about this? First of all, I love to talk about this stuff, but this is a problem a lot of us struggled with for a long time because it drove us crazy. Because, like, I don't want to change this. This, like, it made us really unhappy to change our domain model just to make Entity Framework happy. And all of a sudden now we've got this exposed players, and you know, we did write this nice way of adding a player, but it's really easy for somebody to go through the player's property and just do whatever they want in there, right? And that doesn't work for control freaks. So this was a huge thing for a lot of us who were using Entity Framework and cared a lot about domain-driven design. So I do have tests in here, these memory tests, in-memory tests to, you know, it runs through and just tests that the stuff works now, right? I can store them, I can retrieve them, even though I've written them in the nice way, the way I want to, but thank goodness now Entity Framework comprehends IEnumerable. And you don't need me to run that test to prove it. You believe me?
Yeah.
You believe me? Okay, good. I love that. Yeah, there's one thing, you know, coding on the fly is great, but it takes a lot of time. And I already spent plenty of the time creating that stuff. So this is actually really huge. And notice also a little tool up there. This is for protecting my aggregate, right? This is really, really important way of doing design. So, value objects. Now, value objects is something I'm going to spend a little more time talking about. And I'm also looking at the time going, holy smokes, what have I done? We're here till like
Tomorrow
morning. Everybody brought their pajamas, right? You've been waiting for years for me to arrive. Here I am. I'm never leaving. I'm just going to do a whole great job. So I really, first of all, who here uses value objects until they get them? Great, right? That's not a lot of people. Who has heard of them but doesn't really understand what they are, right? And then the rest of you. So these are magical. And I want to make sure I'm going to do my best to try to help you understand them, but I want to make sure that you hear this. It took me 5 different explanations of value objects over about the course of a year before I finally went, oh, now I get it, okay? So just understand that, and it's okay not to totally get it. It's not because you're not smart, it's just because they're really hard to get. And if you do totally get it, I'm like, to this. I know somebody who told me, somebody who's written a book on domain-driven design, who I respect a lot. He is a brilliant guy. And I told him about this. As a matter of fact, the 5th thing that I heard, that was him. And it wasn't because he told me the right thing. It was me being able to take all of those different ideas, and then together they helped me really, really get it. And he said, well, if you read my book carefully, you might realize that I didn't really get them either. I didn't know it until like a couple years later, right? So, but they really are magical. So a value object, I mentioned this before. Oh, you could use these in Entity Framework 6. Entity Framework 6 had this concept called complex types. And complex types allowed us to map value objects. EF Core 1 didn't have complex types or any other way to do it. Now the team said complex types was, okay, but actually it's constraining us from being able to do other things and really support value objects in a bigger way. Because complex types weren't about value objects, they were about complex types, and a value object is kind of a super complex type, super smart complex type. So in Entity Framework Core 2, they brought back their new way of allowing us to map these, and it was referred to as own types. There were some limitations in EF Core 2, 2.1 and 2.2 that were still kind of problematic for value objects, and it's getting fixed in EF Core 3, which I'm really excited about. And if you want, I thought it might be fun, since we're gonna be here all night anyway, it might be fun to take that branch and switch it to EF Core 3 and see if I can get rid of my workarounds that I had to use in the EF Core 2. So let's first talk about value objects. I wanna make sure you have at least some kind of comprehension of them. So this is just part of the list of an attribute of what a value object is. So a value object doesn't have an identity key in the way an entity does. That's the big differentiator between an entity and a value object. An entity has an actual key, so you can track that. So you can always go find that. You know its ID, you can find it in any system, even if it's persisted in many places. But a value object doesn't have that. A value object doesn't exist on its own. It's always used as a property of another entity or even another value object. So complex types were like that, right? Complex type was a type that was used as a property elsewhere, but you could blow it out into its own different properties. So a value object still has identity, but its identity is defined by the composition of the values of all of its properties, right? So before I talk about some of the other important attributes, I want to make sure you understand this. So a string is a value object. It's a great example of a value object. One thing I just want to make sure you understand is, in the case of a string, it's not just the composition of its properties, or in this case, the chars that make up the string, but also the order of them happens to be important, but that's for a string, right? But for other value objects, the order of those properties is not important. However, if we have a string and it's composed of R and A and T, we know that that's a rat, right? If we were to change one of those properties, one of those chars, we completely change what it is. Its identity changes totally. It's no longer a rat, it's a cat, it's completely different. Or if we change another one, it's a car, it's a completely different thing, right? That's why strings are immutable, right? Because what you're doing when you're changing it, it's not the same as correcting a typo, right? Or autocorrect, making a typo, which it does to me all the time. Right, and that's different. So a typo is, that's a special case. So essentially, changing any of those properties or those chars completely changes what the meaning of that is. Money is a really important type of value object, and therefore value objects are really critical in financial systems. So here are two properties of money: quantity and currency, right? So 45,000 Swedish kroners might buy you HoloLens, right? They're pretty expensive. But if I change the currency to US dollars, maybe I'll get myself a little Ferrari. An old beat up one, probably, not as shiny as this. Right, so just the identity of this thing changes so completely by just changing one of those values. So it's the composition of those values that's really critical to understanding what that object is. Does that make sense? And we can even add a third property to this, because if you think about it, the value of $45,000 is really, in the financial markets, moment by moment by moment that changes, right? So that's another perspective of a value object. Believe it or not, the one that nailed it for me had something to do with a carton of eggs. And I don't remember what it was. And that was by Jimmy Nilsson. And I told him about this recently, and he said, oh, I wrote an article, because I said, I don't remember what it was you said, but it was something about eggs, and that was when I finally had my aha moment. So he sent me a link to an article. It's in Swedish, so I'm going to have to see if Google will help me do it. So that's the essential concept of what a value object is. And I told you I had a person full name value object in my system, right? So that I didn't have to keep repeating all the things that I care about on a name in the player object or in the manager object. So here's just an example of what a person full name class would look like. So first of all, I have a first and last name property. There's a getter and a private setter. The only way to set those properties is through the constructor. Right, there's no, the setter isn't exposed. There's no methods in here, set first name, set last name. So this is really, really important. They are immutable, just like strings are, right? A value object, you have to design them so that they're immutable, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't be a value object. So it's really, really important. Now, I've added in here some methods, some behaviors that I want to make sure I always have whenever I use a person full name. So for example, I always want to be able to get back to full name. So instead of in my player class having a, return first name plus last name, and in the manager, return first name plus last name, right? That's encapsulated in my value object. And maybe a full name reverse. So these are things I always want. And then I can keep, as I have new ideas about things I might want to do with names, I can just put them in this class. Now, here are two other really important attributes that weren't on the list yet. I can say, because the next slide has them, which is you have to override the equals and the get hash code. And what that does, it gives you the ability to check the equality, to compare different instances of these value objects, right? So this will know, equals will always be sure to check both of those properties, right? And the get hash code is useful so that when you're using the equal sign, or when you're using the operators, it'll understand how to compare them to make sure they're equal. So that's really important. So those are the attributes of a value object. So they're attributes that you have to build into that class in order for them to be one. And then the only time, since it doesn't have its own identity key, you can't just store rat, right? You can't just store all on its own the object 45,000 SEK, right? That's going to be used as a property of something else. What is this worth in money? So it doesn't have its own identity key. It's dependent for persistence. It's dependent on the class that it is a property of, right? Or if it's sub-property. So in Entity Framework Core, we have something called an owned type. And an owned type isn't there to support value objects. That's not its purpose, but it is one of the things you can do with an owned type. Okay, an owned type still is like a. I think I went a little too far there. Oh, an owned type has no identity key and it's used as a property of an entity. Right, that's all that Entity Framework looks for. So that allows us to add in these features to our value object classes and Entity Framework, because it has these two attributes, Entity Framework knows how to persist it. Does that make sense? And again, watching the time, do you want to see a little bit of that in action? And I can have a little fun trying to see how easily I can remove, I'll explain and then remove the hack I had to do to get over one of the problems that was in there. So in order to let Entity Framework know that this class is a value object and therefore a property of, it's still a property. If you just coded it in there, it would just look like a related object, right? So we need to explicitly tell Entity Framework that this is an owned type, right? And it can't discover it on its own. So I'm just wanting you to see that. So we would, in the mappings, we just have to use the owns one mapping. That's a new mapping. There's also an owns many. I haven't played with it yet. That's fairly new. It came with 2.2. I thought they had decided to push it to 3.0, and then somebody from the team said, no, it's in there. Like, oh, I better go figure out how that works. So When you're doing a mapping in the DB context, right, you refer to the entity and then you say it owns, that property in there, by the way, is an owned entity. So one of the problems that they originally had was, we're not, if it's a value object, it's immutable. We're not going to edit it. So we have to replace it. And entity framework, if you were replacing a property with another property and it was owned, entity framework didn't allow us to do that. And that was one of the problems. The other problem, which was a lot worse, was that if you said a property was owned, I'm putting my screen. If you said a property was owned in this way, entity framework could not deal with a null owned entity, right? So, I guess in the case of my model, I guess it doesn't make sense for a player or a manager not to have a name. But let's say there's a scenario in which it makes sense. We don't know the person, we're hiring this guy, but we don't know, to get our team, this woman to be on our team, but we don't know her name yet. Okay, that really doesn't make any sense, but just go with me on that. So there was just never a possibility of doing that because the way entity framework worked out those mappings, it absolutely had to have the values in there. So I came up with kind of a workaround, and then I showed it to one of the guys on the team. And remind me that when I do that, it goes away. Okay. Just go over there. You can still see it. Okay. So I'm going to go to value objects. So, and I showed the workaround to somebody on the team, and he actually helped me fine tune it. And the way I solved it was twofold. I did a little bit of logic inside of the value object. And where's it's in the shared kernel. So here's the person full name. Make this go away. So notice I have two different factoring methods. One called create that passes in a first or last, that passes in the strings, right? So that's like the standard. Anytime I'm going to create a person full name, I'm passing in the strings. No problem. Then I gave myself this concept, which was I have a constructor that is just called empty. So it did force me in my logic to have additional logic, right? Like it is paying me a little bit to do this because I'm affecting my domain model to satisfy entity framework. But I was able to hide all of this extra logic in, a little bit of it, just a tiny little bit of it inside the value object, and the rest of it, the context is taken care of. So here's how I got this to work. If I ever wanted to create a full name, this is the only way to do it. So for example, let's see, here, yeah. So inside of player, if I pass the first and last name into a constructor for the player, I could say person full name create, right? And that would give me back an instance of the value object, right? So that was not so bad. And then the rest of it, I solved it inside of the context. So imagine I haven't assigned the name yet. I haven't defined that name yet. It's null. When Entity Framework tries to get everything ready to create the SQL, it freaks out, right? And it throws an error. So what I did was I overrode save changes. Come on, why am I not seeing it here? Am I in the value objects after? Oh, maybe you know what? I didn't put the workaround in here. Okay, I can just explain it. I actually wrote a whole article about it too. I overrode save changes. Save changes would look for full name, and it would say, oh, if it's still null, go and give me an empty one. And the definition of an empty one is that empty is that it just it still instantiates it, but it just put null in the two strings. So it's okay for the string, the properties to be null values, but the object itself couldn't be null. So I let the context, before the context was about to really push it down into the wire, it would go, oh, wait, we didn't instantiate this yet. Go ahead and instantiate it with null values. Then, when it reads it, oh, come back. Team context. Pretty sure I'm doing it here. Well, I'm just going to explain it. Then when it reads it, it would see, when it comes back from the database, it would see the object, because the object exists, but the two values were null. And it would say, oh, that one with the nulls, that's really a null object. So it would actually instantiate the player with a null name, right? It would know. So I wrote kind of this trickery. I put as much of the logic in, again, with the help of somebody from the team to streamline it. As much as the logic, you're not seeing it here, as much of the logic as possible in the DB context in order to solve this. Yeah, it's not in here because I didn't want to have to explain it, right? I didn't want to have to go down that road when I was doing these demos in other scenarios. So I put as much of the logic in the context, so Entity Framework was taking care of its own shit, right? And then I didn't have to worry so much about it in my domain. Anyway, so supposedly it supports it now. So let's test out that theory. I already have EF Core 3, .NET Core 3 installed on here, and I believe I have to change my projects. Oh, did I already change this project? It looks like I already changed this project to 3. Yes, I already changed excellent. This branch, everything is already set up to be using 3.0. I haven't,
Standard 2.1.
oh, that's, okay, so do you understand that they had to do something that was heartbreaking for the .NET Core team because it was going to be really, really confusing for the whole world. But they had to go down this route so that they were ready to start aligning things. And the .NET standard version now is not in sync with .NET Core version. So yeah, so I've got .NET Core 2.1, 2.2, and 3.0 installed on this machine. And yeah, we have to use .NET Standard 2.1. You look at the console. Look, .NET Core App 3.0. So .NET Core App, if all the 3.0 things use .NET Standard 2.1. Please don't get Kathleen Dollard here, she'll explain. She was the person who finally said, it's Kathleen Dollard said, we have to do it this way. I totally accept it. I think she's been here. So I guess the way to test this would be to remove, but I didn't have did I have the empty logic in there? I only described it. Oh, I didn't have it for persisting. No, I don't even have the empty logic in here. All right, I'm not using person full name. I'm not ignoring it, I'm really using it, so that's good. I guess what I have to do, I know what I'll do. I've removed the empty thing. It's definitely not in there, but also the workaround isn't in here. The way I avoided it with my tests was I didn't have a test that used a null person name, right? In all my cases, I'm definitely passing the person name in. So can store and retrieve a player name. That's the one I'm going to try to run. Why isn't this giving me I'm looking for code lens. Where's code lens? Why isn't it popping up? It's enabled. Let me build this. I don't want you to think badly of Visual Studio Code when I'm seeing these weird problems. These weird problems are happening because I'm moving back and forth to all these different branches and expecting it to do things that I don't think are really as normal when you're coding because, demoing, which I have a lot of different expectations of Visual Studio Code than when I'm just plain old writing code. So let me do a .NET build and see if that pops back in. And it's pretty cool that CodeLens is in Visual Studio Code also. Does anybody use that in Visual Studio? Yeah. Because I just wanted to run the one test, but it's building, it's succeeding. Right, that's not. Come on, come on. Okay. So you never have anything happen like this when you're coding, right? Everything goes perfectly smoothly. Command, comma. So actually this is really good because sometimes I'm a little embarrassed that some people think like I'm special, but you can just see how I'm just really stupid. Like some people. Not everybody here. You're probably all smarter than me and good at this and better at this than me. So yeah, I've got CodeLens enabled. Why is it not showing? I gave a really good answer to that in Portland, Oregon once. Right, Carrie? She was there, she witnessed it.
It's true.
I swore at CodeLens like a trucker. Thank goodness it was Portland, Oregon. Everybody laughed. Okay, so I'm not going to do it that way. I'm just going to run all the tests and get it over with. So here's the test that really matters. I just wanted to run this one test. CodeLens would have allowed me to do that, but it's half doing CodeLens. This is really aggravating. Let me close this and open it again. This is just weird. Okay, let's just see what happens here.
Check for Miller's.
What happens here? No, I was running these before. I was running these, whoever came in here to talk to me about mics and things, you saw me. I was like running these tests and doing all this. I'm just gonna .NET test, that's all. So .NET build works, CD test, .NET test. So it'll just run all the tests in this, in not just EF Core and memory test, but this domain class tests too. And they'll just all pass, right? They'll just all pass. Okay, good. So what I'm curious about is there's no workarounds in there anymore. And I'm wondering, I add player, does player, add player, team add player, I need to let it, so right now it's not letting me, it doesn't even let me pass in a null value, right? So I'm going to go to definition. I'm going to go to definition. Yeah, it's
not
acting
happy.
up. Let me just do this again. I just want to see if this pop in. Come on, come on, come on, come on. Where are they? No, they're still being complete. Sorry, that was my American English.
Yep, got one test.
Hey.
So it was because I was doing it wrong, right? Clearly I was doing something wrong. So annoying. So this should now work. Go to definition. Yeah, it's just, it's being so nasty. So I'm going to, that's what I'll do. I'm just going to say, nope, no full name, right? Let's just take that out of the logic. So now we're never going to have a full name. That doesn't make sense. Oh, I need a better kind of test. Do you see why? Because like, the whole point of this is we're
Just
comparing the full name. All right, what am I going to do?
Just comment out the add line.
All of my logic?
No, just the line where it says add, where it adds it to the page.
Keep removing lines until it.
Down to
Yeah, but if I
No, just down to one more.
where underscore
but
players
then it's
dot add.
comparing player added to team response. Okay, so
Just the add line. Get rid of.
that one?
No, the one that says add, players not add.
That one.
Yeah, you can just comment that one out.
Yeah,
Because then it's done.
but this is looking for full name also.
Yeah, just
No,
don't
comment
comment.
full name as well.
Oh, wait. I'm gonna ruin oh, that's okay, it's just good, I can just undo it. Var, full name, equals, I have no way of doing it.
If you uncomment
Specifies
the
three.
line,
You really think this is gonna work like
if
this?
you uncomment the line above.
Which line above?
So those two lines you just comment.
Come here. I'm not seeing it, because I'm not seeing the trees for the forest.
If we get rid of, sorry.
Haha. Haha, gotcha, Mac.
That's it. Because then it's going to do the check, you just want to add it to the collection. So then it should still be null. Is that right?
Yeah, but I want to add the player, I want the name to be null.
Oh.
Yeah, that's why I was like, I don't understand your logic there. Let's see. This is really funny because this is the opposite of domain-driven design, right?
You protected the domain too well.
I did a really, really good job. So here, I have an idea. Public will add player. That's it. And let's see, var player equals. Can I just say new player? Are you allowed to say new player?
You're going to private.
New player? I don't even know how my thing works anymore.
You just say no.
No, it's not player that's null. It's the name that's null. So I'm trying to prove that I can have a value object that's still null. Come on, this is mob programming here. Nobody's helping me.
Can
Oh,
you not
sorry.
just set first name and last name as null, or will that not work?
No, because that's the workaround. That's the workaround. I want to not instantiate this, so I want to just create a new player. So add a player, player is null, you must first retrieve, okay, person full name, so I'm creating the full name, and then doing player. If it's not found, then where am I creating a new player? Oh, because I commented out.
So right there.
So do I have the ability to just create a new player? This is crazy.
If
Talk about doing on-the-fly coding.
You need an overload on the new player, player constructor that has
Just a
null.
default constructor.
Default constructor of the player.
Yeah.
You've made it private at the moment.
Yes, I protected it very well from that problem. Really, really well. And I did that so that I could run the demos without having to deal with the, deal with that value object problem. And now I want the value object problem to come back so I can prove it. So now I have that public, and again, I'm just going to, I'm just not going to save any of this. So now I'm going to go back to team, and I'm just going to create a new player, and then add that player to the team players, right? That's all I should have to do. Players.add, new players.add, oh yeah. See, that was easy. Can you imagine me trying to actually write production code? It would never, ever get done. Add. Underscore players. That really should do it. Now, why are you unhappy? Not all code has return value. Oh, return true. So, this is not how to write. This is not what domain-driven design teaches you, right? This is like entity framework failure-driven design, right? I'm just trying to prove a point.
I think you need your player ID in the constructor.
Pardon me?
There won't be player ID set either, so you know as well.
Well, I think this should do the trick, and I just need my test to just add a new player, right? I want to prove that I can add a new player without a value object, but the other funny thing is the player, this was just this model does just not work for the thing that I want to prove. This model doesn't make any sense for the thing I'm trying to prove. This actually is a really interesting point because the model is designed so nicely to match the domain I described. that in order to try to break it, right, prove this point and everything, I protected it from that null value object in a lot of ways. So I guess I'm just gonna have to like do this at home because I don't wanna just keep breaking my code, breaking my model, breaking this just to prove the point. I thought it would be kind of fun, but it's stopped being fun. For me, at least. So like, it's not gonna be fun for you until I start swearing like a trucker. Then everybody's gonna be on Twitter saying, did you hear what Julie said? And yeah, my husband will be like, and your point is, we hear that all the time at home. Oh yeah, that's really annoying. So, I really wish I had a way to just like, I want to see that right now, but it's too much work to just untangle this so much or tangle this up so much to make that work. But, you know, on the other hand, maybe I'm just that close. Maybe it'll just work. If it would be, you know, it would have been cool if I had done this in EF Core 2 and showed you it breaking, and then switch it to EF Core 3 and show it to you working. Team.add player. I think that it makes absolutely no sense to me to do it this way, but we might as well just keep going down the path.
Do your players all have to have an ID?
Yeah, it'll get an ID. So I'm curious, we put a breakpoint here and we just debug it and see what happens. So where is the method? Can store and retrieve team player. So let's debug it. Who knows? I should have maybe built it first. I just wanted to see it. Debugging Visual Studio is a little chatty. So, oh wait, some grapes right up here. Anything happening? To exit it.
It's a little test.
I think we need to run that test which you changed.
I'm hearing little bits of words.
You ran the wrong test, I think was what
Can
I
store and
heard.
retrieve team players?
That's the one you're
That's the wrong test.
You scored up.
Seriously?
You've run up the whole test.
No. This code up here is not the test that, of course I ran the wrong test. This code up here is, oh, right, because one of these up here is a supporting method. I thought that's what I was doing. All right. I hope you guys still have respect for me in the morning. Oh my God, I had no idea she was such a crazy person. That's gonna be like ripping the page of his book out that it's not, burning it in a funeral pyre. I thought she knew what she was doing. Okay, so we have a player. Oh, we have a player. Step in. Also, if you haven't used Visual Studio Code before, I hope you're going, what? You can do this? This is so cool. On a Mac. You can do this on a Mac? Debugging? Okay, so now it's building up the in-memory context. And actually, that's good. You can do all kinds of cool debugging in here. Team, players, it has a player. We have a player. But that's just, you know, that's logic, right? We haven't done persistence yet. But the name factor, the person full name, is null. So the question is, when it comes to save changes, is it going to blow up or not? Skip over that. Building the context. Now we're adding the team, full team to the context. That's just context code. Okay, that's going to save changes. Did not blow up. Now we're creating a brand new context. And going to read from that in-memory store. I'm including all the players, so we know there's one player. Just go out there, debug. and I'm asserting that there is one player in there. Let's just look. One player. With no name, with a null, not just null values in the name. Okay, so now, all of you have seen that EF Core, the team, they fixed the problem, so we have to go to the GitHub issue and go, yay! I hope there was some value to you in seeing that. It was huge to me. It's the first time I got to see it, right? I'm like, yes, we had to write this whole workaround, right? Which is because NA Framework Core was only halfway supporting value objects. Because, a value object, if I don't want to populate it, that's my business, right? It's not NA Framework Core's business. But NA Framework Core couldn't comprehend how to persist and how to retrieve it if it was null, right? And I wonder, it would be really cool to see if I opened up the code in GitHub to see if some of the logic that Andrew and I worked out for the workaround, maybe if they're using that same kind of logic. So anyway, oh my God, well, it was still pretty fun. So who using NA Framework 6 has ever had a one-to-one relationship? Build a one-to-one relationship into your model, right? And we have to, NA Framework would not understand that one-to-one relationship because it couldn't on its own figure out which was the dependent and which was the principal.
You all plugged in?
No, you just
Oh,
said
come
not to.
on.
You carry on, I'll do it.
I had enough power for a normal length talk. That's about the time when you should think about, yeah, I'm like going on and on and on. I mean, are you okay with this? Is everybody like, shh?
Yes.
Okay. Because this is what happens. If it's like at a conference, I'm like, I'm on time. But when I'm in a user group, I'm like, I just want to teach you everything. Here.
No, on that. You carry on talking.
It goes here. It goes here, the power through. No, I can't. It's not possible. I need to carry on talking. I don't really do that talking thing. I don't like to talk.
Done.
0. Okay. So, has anybody dealt with one-to-one? And the problem is, you can't, we went both back up, you raise your hand, and nobody else does, so you're the only person who cares about this. But again, it's actually really important. NA Framework was never able to comprehend on its own by reading your code which was the parent and which was the child in a one-to-one relationship. And we always had to, oh my gosh, we had to do two things. We had to have a common, they had a shared primary key. Did I have it? Do I have it here? Yeah. So in order to do an EF1 through 6, we had to share. So here's the principal, here's the dependent. They had to share a primary key. We were forced to do that. We couldn't just put a foreign key in here. This was the foreign key, but it was also the primary key. And it was like we had to do it just to make Entity Framework happy. In addition, we still had to do one more thing. We had to explicitly define the which they both have primary keys now, right? Which one's the foreign key? Which one's the how do they relate to each other, right? There's no this is in here. This understands that these two are connected. So we had to have a shared primary key. We had to have the navigation properties in both of them, even if we didn't want them. And most times I don't want bidirectional navigations. It's another thing that really was an enlightening concept for me from domain-driven design, that we kind of default to putting bidirectional navigations, even if we never use one of them, right? And then we're stuck with always having to deal with it, even if we don't even ever use it, right? Because it can't be null, so we have to keep populating it. And then when we try to persist it, it gets all screwed up, right? So it's like that's a side effect. So DDD really helped me understand that concept. That think about which navigation. Do you really need the navigations in both ends? Anyway, so that drove me crazy. Had to put them in there because you had to explicitly describe which was the parent and which was the child. And in order to do that, you had to have the navigation properties. That's the only way you could make that mapping, right? So one-to-one relationships, if you're coming from DDD thinking and trying to make things clean and not have side effects and not have all this extra code just to make entity framework happy, because now I have extra maintenance to deal with in my code. I have to worry about the side effects of having this extra navigation, and I've got this principal ID, which I don't want that to be my key. I want it to have dependent has its own primary key, and I want to have a foreign key, right? And now EF Core lets me design it the way I want to, right? So now it can understand it. So like it just understands it now. So I have my ID for my principal class. I have my ID that's specific to my dependent class. I can just have a foreign key here, right? And then I can, in most cases, just get away with that. It'll understand it. Even I still maybe have to have some description, but for the most part, it understands just magically the one-to-one relationships without having to go through all that extra stuff. So that was a really, really huge thing for Entity Framework Core. And if you haven't experienced it and you're all like, whatever, I hope you're not whatever, even if you haven't experienced yourself, because hopefully you'll start thinking more about these things. But the other thing that's really interesting from domain-driven design about one-to-one relationships is DDD forces you to really stop and think about those one-to-one relationships, because you may, once you get really starting to understand things about DDD more, most likely 99% of those relationships where you think you have a one-to-one relationship makes more sense for that dependent entity to actually be a value object instead of that. So we actually get rid of a lot of relationships. As a matter of fact, Von Vernon, he's written a couple of DDD books. He's a DDD guru, expert, maybe some of you heard of him or read one of his books. He said it's most likely that more of the classes in your system would be value objects than entities. You'll probably have more value objects than entities once you start really understanding the concepts and designing these aggregates and thinking about these things. So that's really interesting. What I try to do is I try to first think of something, I try to default to thinking it's a value object, right? I try to default when I think, one-to-one relationship, I go, no, don't start that way. Prove to me that it's not a value object, that it should be a one-to-one relationship. That's kind of how I go about it. I do the same thing with that concept of unidirectional or bidirectional relationships. Prove to me that I need both ends, both navigations. I don't mean that the relationship disappears, because we still express a relationship. We just don't need to navigate, have a property that represents the full class. So back to one-to-one. Now that it's smarter about one-to-one relationships, and so sometimes you still are going to have one-to-one, right? It's still possible now that it's smarter about one-to-one, and it has this capability of having backing fields for scalar properties. You can also have backing fields for navigation properties in one-to-one relationships, okay? And I'm not even going to show you the code, but the point is that you can hide. So if you have yes, I have to, because I can't explain it otherwise. I can't describe it well. I'll try not to dwell on it. And I just discard all of those changes. Map one-to-one, encapsulate one-to-one. I want to at least make sure you know what I mean by encapsulating one-to-one. Restore. We'll try to restore. And ignore the squiggly lines again. It's just being really silly. One-to-one relationship. Oh, that's the manager, right? A team has one manager at a time. So what I did was I encapsulated this one-to-one relationship So instead of having a getter and setter, whenever anybody's asking for the manager, I'm returning a backing field. The backing field still is a representation of the object, the manager object, okay? But now if somebody wants access to it, I'm returning the private field. So I have this private field, and then the other thing I encapsulated was I don't need, from the team, I don't really want somebody to get back the whole manager and everything about the manager. Like I don't want them to even see the ID of the manager. I just want them to see the name. So all I exposed was the name. So now the only public property I have here is a string that's manager name, and it's going to dig into this private field that nothing else can access and return the name. So that's a nice thing to do when you're designing your domain models. And what's cool is now Entity Framework supports this. It doesn't support it by default. There's some mappings that you need to do in order to support it. And manager, yeah, it's down here, right? So it's just, I just have to explicitly let it know. So Entity Framework doesn't magically know everything, but so it's a lot smarter with its default mappings and things it can discover and handle all by itself. But there's tons of new scenarios where we have really nice ways to express edge cases in the context when we're mapping the context. So I think that's the most important lesson, right? Like you don't have to memorize how I've done this mapping, but just knowing that it's possible to do those kinds of things. Okay. Mapping many-to-many. I don't know how many people like those magical many-to-many relationships. I mean, it's a really nice way to describe your domain, right? Just to say maybe in just that, I know I have it in here. Oh, it was the team history, right? That's part of my many-to-many, right? Because in team history, one manager might be on many teams and one team might have many managers, okay? So it's nice to be able to just say that team past managers and past manager the teams it's been on and not have to write any other code. Unfortunately, EF Core still, it's on the radar, but because we have a way around it, they're like just setting it aside until they get some more important things done. So right now, in order to map many-to-many, we have to go to do it explicitly in the same way we do inside the relational database. So we have to have a joint entity, right? We could do this in, we could always have this option of going this way, this very explicit way, even in EF, just plain entity framework 1 through 6, right? But unfortunately with EF Core right now, that's the only way to do a many-to-many. So you have to pay a lot more attention to how you're constructing these relationships and how you're doing queries and how you're building up the graphs when you want to persist data. So I'm sorry. Don't shoot me, I'm just the messenger. However, from another perspective, even though it's a little more work, for me, and this is again some of the DDD thinking that I've grown to love, right? Because it's helped me so much. I now look at this and say, I'm now taking explicit control instead of letting Entity Framework do magic underneath the covers that I don't have control over, right? The magic of, because normally what EF would do is magically create that join table and magically manage all of those joins and relationships when you're building link queries or when you're retrieving data, and it does all of that. So in a way, I kind of like that because I get to completely control how that's going. And as you know by now, I'm a control freak, right? So it totally speaks to my ADD. So that's just letting you know. So a couple of other, let's see if there's anything else in here besides this. I think this might be the last one. This is the last one. And there's other wonderful things, but these are the ones that I wanted to highlight. This is really, really important. Value conversions. So there's a lot of types in .NET that Entity Framework doesn't understand because the relational databases don't understand these types, right? We have, I don't know how many types there are in SQL Server. Maybe, let's say there are 10 types in SQL Server, but there's, like 500 scalar types or whatever in .NET. Obviously, I'm exaggerating. Because, the later this gets, the more loosey-goosey I get, right? Anyway, have you had that situation where you're using a .NET type, but you can't map it, so now you have to write all this code, right? Perfect example, go to Stack Overflow and search how to store system.color in, using Entity Framework, or without even Entity Framework, how to store a color in a database. You have to convert it to a string, and then you have to convert it back to a color, right? So Entity Framework now gives you an easier way to do the value conversions. It even has a whole bunch that it will do by itself. It already knows how to do, but then you have your own types and do all kinds of other stuff. I want to just give you an overview kind of how it's working. So you understand not just what it is, but what it isn't. It doesn't magically do the conversions. What it starts with is you're working with a .NET type that doesn't have a mapping. The database doesn't understand, therefore the database provider isn't able to just magically figure out how to put it into the database, right? Then what either you or the converter, like if you write your own custom converter or you have some way of explicitly doing it yourself or using one of the existing ones. What it does is it converts it to a .NET type that does have a mapping. That's what we're really doing. So it doesn't magically now know how to store .NET types that don't have mappings to the database that the database doesn't understand. What we're doing is, first we're going to convert it to a .NET type that the database and Entity Framework do understand, and then persist it, right? And when it's time to read it, we take the data type from the database, we bring it, Entity Framework reads it, right? And now it's starting out as not the type you want, but the type that Entity Framework understands how to do the mapping, and then it converts it back. So you're essentially dealing with code that impacts in here and in here, okay? What do they look like? There's a couple of ways to do it. Here's in the context when you're doing configuring. You're going to focus on the property that you want to map, and then you say it has a conversion. There's different ways to express the conversion. You can express it on the fly and just say, first convert it to this type, and then go ahead and save it, right? And so it's got two parameters, right? Convert it to this type, and then now the type that comes back out, here's how to convert it back to the type that belongs to that property. That's one way to do it. You can encapsulate it into a local variable. You can even encapsulate it into a class that you can reuse across projects. So there are, maybe there's more now with EF Core 3, but with 2.2, there was about 15 that they built in. Did I show them here so they don't have to? No. So I have a little, wait, no. You can't see it anymore. I remembered this time. That's really funny. So, encapsulate one. Do you know what happens every time the Entity Framework comes out with a new version? I have to go through. These are all from Origin, so they don't count. But I have to go through all of these and update every single one. That's annoying. I only updated one of those to EF Core 3. See if I can make the squiggly lines go away without closing code. Of course not. Oh, wait. No, they just got hidden. All right, well, they all work. You know they work. So in team has a property called uniform color. And uniform color, come on, it's here. I'm not making it up like I made. Where is it? It's hiding down the bottom, so I didn't have to worry about it. than the other ones. Okay. So I have this idea of uniform color, this property called home colors, which is uniform color. Uniform color is made up of a whole bunch of different colors. Notice they're all colors, 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 right? So before we would have to write all our code to convert all these colors and not be able to store them, but now I can store them. And the way I'm able to do that is in the context. Now, I forgot to look. Maybe I wonder if they changed this in 3. Don't worry, we're not going to go through this, but it's just a note in my head that maybe they fixed this. Notice that I'm specifying the same exact conversion for every single one of those color properties. That's because Entity Framework didn't, up to 2.2 when it introduced this, it didn't have the ability to say, do this for all these properties, right? Anytime you see a color property in my class, just use this conversion. So you had to explicitly do it to each one. So this was one of the ways to express it. The first parameter is what to convert it to before you store it. So the color is actually a structure, not a type. I learned that when I was working on this demo. I was like, oh, duh. How many years have I been working with .NET? I didn't know that. Or I forgot it 18 times. Anyway, so it just happens to have a method to convert to name. This is actually a property. This is a property of the color structure. So that just takes a string, and that's what it's going to store. This is just, it's a lambda, right? So we're going to store the name, and when that string comes back, it's going to come back as a string. So just use the color structure and then call its from name method to create a new color from whatever came back from the database. And that's it, right? So that's the most simple way of doing it. And again, you can encapsulate this. You can create a variable in your context and just keep using the variable over and over again. Or you can create another class that you can use across. So yeah, I'd be interested in seeing how that works. And I just ran this test a little while ago before I came out to eat pizza. So I should have this little, and I ran it. I also noticed I suddenly have a new class in here that is the SQLite tests. So this actually creates the real database. And I have an extension in here that lets me look at SQLite databases. I wasn't careful about where the database got created because I didn't care because it's just a little demo test. So it happens to be right here. And I've got the SQLite extension, so I'm going to open the database. This was the first extension that lets you actually look at SQLite. We're not actually looking at it, are we? Maybe it's down here. I said to open it up to the side, but whatever. So here's the uniform colors table. See, you can see already there. It knows that they were text. And here, there they're stored as just text. Right, but then it comes in and out. Gets stored as text. But it's automatic. So that's what's really nice about the value conversion. It gives you a really easy way. Oh, I'm still online? Thanks. You go with your beautiful shirt. The value converters. So EF Core value converters. I just wanted to just quickly see a list. I should have just put them in my slides. EF Core value converters. Yeah, he's like, I'm watching to see if this just disappears. Am I online? Maybe not. Let's see what the weather is in the house. Oh well. There's a list of them. So for example, enums. We can store enums as strings. That's one of them, right? So that one, how many people have done that one? I mean, you can, by default, EF will store enums as integers, but a lot of times we want to store them as strings. So that's an example of one of the built-in ones. So there's another one I've done some demos of that was a pain. to do otherwise, and I can't think of what it was. Anyway, so, but there's a whole bunch of, oh, I know, it was for timestamps, time intervals, to be able to store time more easily, right? So there's all kinds of there's a bunch of built-in converters. It was always funny to me that there wasn't one for color, like, because it seems like the obvious one. I hope they don't put it in, because then I would have to come up with a new demo of why you would want to have a, do your own. But if I did, I would probably do that in advance of a talk instead of going, oh, let's just see how this works on the fly. Anyway, so that's that one. And then the very last one I want to make sure you're aware of is shadow properties. So shadow properties is really good, something that you can really use for storing stuff like audit data. And oh, I've done it again. Oh, no, there it is. Okay, I just want you to see what they look like. Yeah, always can. But okay, so we'll open up so shadow properties are data that only your context is aware of, that you can store in your database. So pieces of information that you really want to be tracked along with your entity data, but you don't want to put it inside of your entities. So how many people have written date added, date modified, modified by into their classes, right? And again, don't do that shyly. We've all done it, right? How else are you going to do it? We need it. We want it. So what's really cool is, especially with the DDD thinking, like, I don't want to put that database, that has nothing to do with my business model, my business logic, right? And I'm like, oh God, don't make me put it in here, but I don't know how else to do it. So value objects is another one of the new features in Entity Framework Core that is really, really nice for people kind of really, thinking along those DDD lines, or that are like embarrassed that they have to put that stuff into classes, right? Like, yeah, we do, because how else are we going to do it? So I think audit data is a really, really good example. So the way to do it, there's two pieces to this. One is modeling, model creating, it's in here, okay, here it is. So here's these two lines of code, which say, this is standard code for configuring properties in your entities, right? So I'm saying, okay, inside team, the entity name team, I've got this property name, daytime property called created. Now normally I would start that way, and then I would say, and I want you to do something special with it, like, I want there to be a key, or what am I doing with that mapping? Here, all I'm doing is expressing the property. And if we look at the team, now I just happen to do it for team, but you can write this generically also to say, I want every single one of my classes to be that way, except not your value objects, because your value objects are properties of your entities. So you already have them. So I don't have this in here, but like in my articles in MSDM magazine, where I dig further into this kind of stuff, I actually show examples of how to do that generically and how to make sure you avoid, say, except for the value objects. So I haven't changed team at all. Team does not have these daytime properties in it. I could scroll through all this, or I could say, I know you believe me, because I wouldn't lie. Might make a mistake, but I wouldn't lie. Anyway, so basically what I'm doing is saying, hey, you know that created daytime property in team? Wink, wink, right? You know that property? That's all I'm saying, right? And it goes, oh yeah, that property. I'm going to build that into the model, and I'm going to make sure that if I'm using migrations and creating the database, that I create that property in the table. And I'm going to pay attention to that property when I'm persisting data and when I'm reading data, right? But it's not going to be looking for it in the team. It doesn't exist. It's just in the data model. Now that, I think, is a really interesting example, going back to that concept of, the white tower, where you would have your own data model, additional, your domain model, an explicit data model to map to the database, and then those people who gave me so much crap for saying, about using Entity Framework, you have to use a data model, and I would say, Entity Framework creates its own data model. Like, this is a really good expression of that. Like, here's a data model that is, I'm putting stuff in there that has nothing to do with the domain model. So that's just saying it exists. And then the next question is, well, how am I going to put any data in it? So what I'm doing here, for this particular case, what I'm doing here is every time I'm calling save changes, I'm looking for any entities that are about to be saved that are teams, right? And I'm saying if it's added or modified, then go to the last modified property and update its value to the timestamp that I created up there, right? So I'm persisting it along with the rest of the data that's coming in from the entity itself. And then the question is, well, how do I query it with length? First, stop and think, right? This is the audit data that I just wanted to stuff in the database, but it's not part of my entity. It's not really part of my domain. So typically, I'm not going to be doing that anyway, right? I'm going to be using that with reporting systems when I'm, in business intelligence and things like that. It has nothing to do with my domain. There is a way to write a link query where you can get these, very specific context-only properties out if you really, really want to see them. Right? There's a way to do it. But typically, the point of this is these aren't part of your model, so you're not going to want them anyway. Right? They're for other purposes. So I think that's a really, really important problem solver, especially when you care a lot about not putting those entities in there. Okay, is it like 10 already? It's dark. You guys are amazing. That was it. That's what I wanted to show you. That's what I traveled how many thousands? 5,000 miles each way to come and show you. So I'm so grateful that you're all here still. Not falling asleep, didn't need more pizza, didn't come and steal my water, and also didn't say, okay, come on, we gotta get home. So thank you. And thank you for letting me show you all this stuff and for welcoming me so much. I once stayed in a 3-hour user group. They were like, keep going. Okay, so here's almost